What if all men died, leaving only women? The Last Dawn. Chapter 1. The Onset. Dr. Louisa Brown's hands trembled as she read the report for the third time. 17 cases in Shanghai, 23 in Mumbai, 41 in Lagos. All men, all experiencing the same rapid cellular breakdown. "It's hitting the emergency rooms everywhere," her colleague Dr. Martinez said, bursting into her office. "London, Sao Paulo, New York, every major city." Louisa's phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Feeling sick, coming home early. Her blood went cold. She'd seen the symptoms firsthand now. Fever, organ failure, complete immune system collapse. The pathogen seemed to target something specific to male biology, attacking the Y chromosome itself. Their best minds had been working around the clock for 2 weeks, but every treatment failed. The hallways of Presbyterian Hospital buzzed with an energy that felt both frantic and hopeless. Louisa had worked emergency medicine for 15 years, but she'd never seen anything like this. The disease showed no respect for age, health status, or geography. A marathon runner died as quickly as a man with diabetes. Children succumbed alongside their grandfathers. Within hours, Michael was in his own hospital bed, his face pale and drawn. Louisa held his hand as colleagues rushed past in the hallway, carrying the latest statistics. The numbers were incomprehensible: millions infected. Mortality rate 100%. "The CDC is calling it Y syndrome," Dr. Martinez reported, returning with more files. "But between you and me, they have no idea what they're dealing with. The pathogen seems to hide in the blood for weeks before attacking. By the time symptoms appear, Louisa watched through the window as ambulances lined up outside the emergency bay. She thought of her brother, Carlos, in Denver, her nephew, Tommy, her father back in Puerto Rico. The phone networks were already overloaded, making contact impossible. "Louisa," Michael whispered, squeezing her fingers. "Promise me you'll find a way through this." She wanted to tell him they'd find a cure, that everything would be fine. But the data told a different story. Whatever this was, it had already spread too far, too fast. The world was about to change forever. Outside, she could hear shouting. Through the window, she saw crowds gathering around the hospital entrance, some families desperate to get their loved ones treated, others angry and demanding answers that no one had. The police were trying to maintain order, but even among the officers, she could see men starting to show the telltale signs of fever and fatigue. As night fell, Louisa realized that the infrastructure keeping society functioning was itself infected. Every power plant worker, every truck driver, every government official, if they were male, they were dying. The collapse wouldn't just be medical. It would be everything. Chapter 2. The Collapse. 3 months later, Louisa stood in the abandoned corridors of Presbyterian General. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls where inspirational posters still hung, their messages about healing and hope now cruel mockeries. The hospital had lost power 6 weeks ago when the last male technician died. The backup generators ran for another week before the fuel ran out. Now they worked by candlelight and battery-powered lanterns, doing what they could with basic supplies. The early weeks after the last deaths had been the worst. Not just the grief, though, that was crushing, but the immediate practical crises. Nuclear power plants had gone into automatic shutdown, but without maintenance crews, several had experienced containment failures. Chemical plants leaked. Dams lost their operators. The lucky cities had women with the right technical knowledge to prevent complete disaster, but most places weren't that fortunate. "Dr. Brown, we need you in the supply room," Elena called out. The former electrical engineer had become their unofficial logistics coordinator, though her expertise meant little when the infrastructure itself was crumbling. Elena had worked for the power company for 12 years, but she'd been one of only 3 women in her department. The institutional knowledge of how to maintain the city's electrical grid had died with her male colleagues. Louisa found Elena inventorying their dwindling medications alongside Maya, who'd transformed the hospital's small garden into their primary food source, and Dr. Reeves, one of the few remaining geneticists. They'd been joined by Carmen, a former police detective who'd become their unofficial security coordinator as reports of violence trickled in from other settlements. "We can't stay here much longer," Elena said, checking items off a handwritten list. "The water pressure's failing, and without parts or repair crews, plus we got another radio transmission from the Jefferson Valley Group." Carmen looked up from cleaning a pistol she'd salvaged from an abandoned police station. "More fighting? They split up 2 weeks ago, some kind of dispute over food distribution. Anna's group has the original settlement, but the breakaway faction took most of the medical supplies. Now they're refusing to share even for emergencies." Louisa felt her stomach tighten. They'd been hearing similar reports from settlements across the region. Without established legal systems or law enforcement, conflicts that might once have been resolved through courts or mediation now escalated into violence. The Denver group had split into 3 factions after a dispute over leadership. The Phoenix settlement had dissolved entirely after fighting erupted over water rights. Through the window, Louisa could see the city beyond traffic lights dark. Abandoned cars scattered across streets, windows boarded or broken. They'd heard radio broadcasts from other survivor groups for a while, but even those had grown increasingly sporadic. Some groups went silent due to equipment failures, others due to internal conflicts that tore them apart. "The problem is trust," Dr. Reeves observed, looking up from a stack of medical journals she'd been copying by hand. "In the old world, we had institutions, police, courts, governments that enforced agreements. Now, if someone decides to break their word, what's to stop them?" Maya, who had been quietly tending seedlings on the windowsill, finally spoke up. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Depression, about communities that survived and ones that fell apart. She always said the difference was whether people could agree on what was fair." Carmen holstered her weapon. "Fair doesn't matter if you're outgunned. I heard from a former colleague up in Portland her group had to abandon their first settlement when another faction decided they wanted the farmland. They lost everything, barely escaped with their lives." Elena traced patterns on the dusty table. "We could fortify this place, try to hold it." "With what army?" Carmen shook her head. "There are 12 of us, and only half know how to use weapons. If a larger, more organized group decided they wanted our supplies—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Louisa thought of Michael's final words, delivered 3 days before he died. "Build something better than what we had." At the time, it had sounded like delirium. Now she wondered if he'd understood better than any of them what was coming. Better than the old world, but the old world had laws, police, systems that prevented might from making right. "There's another option," she said finally. "We've been thinking about this wrong. Instead of trying to hold territory, what if we focused on building alliances? The settlements that are surviving, the ones not tearing themselves apart, they're the ones that trade with each other, that share information." Carmen raised an eyebrow. "You want to be diplomats in the post-apocalyptic wasteland?" "I want us to be the kind of people other groups want to work with, not fight against," Louisa replied. "We have medical knowledge. Elena has engineering skills. Maya understands agriculture. We become valuable to multiple settlements. They have reasons to protect us rather than raid us." Dr. Reeves nodded slowly. "Build networks instead of fortresses." "We need to move to something we can actually maintain," Louisa said finally. "Somewhere we can start over, but somewhere that lets us stay connected to other groups trying to do the same thing." Chapter 3. Adaptation. 6 months after the last man died, Louisa woke to the sound of wood splitting. Their settlement, if you could call 3 patched tents, and a reinforced barn that had grown to house 18 women and 3 young girls. Elena was outside, splitting logs for their wood-burning stove with an efficiency that would have amazed her old engineering professors. The morning routine had become ritualized. Check the hand-pumped well, tend the vegetable plots, inventory supplies, try to coax life from salvaged electronics with failing batteries. Maya had managed to preserve dozens of seed varieties, but their diet consisted mainly of root vegetables and whatever canned goods they could scavenge from abandoned stores. Carmen emerged from the radio shed, looking troubled. She'd been maintaining contact with other settlements, trying to build the network of allies they'd discussed. It was proving more complicated than any of them had hoped. "Problems?" Louisa asked her, noting Carmen's expression. "The Austin group went dark 3 days ago. Last transmission mentioned armed raiders coming from the east." Carmen accepted a cup of chicory coffee. Real coffee was long gone from Maya. "Before we lost contact, they said the raiders were women from a settlement that collapsed near Houston. They're calling themselves the Sisters of Necessity." Elena looked up from her work. "Sisters of what now?" "Necessity, as in do whatever is necessary to survive. According to Austin, they believe that cooperating with other settlements is weakness. They take what they want and move on." Carmen sipped her coffee and made a face. "The Portland group confirmed it. They've been hit twice, lost most of their medical supplies and half their solar panels." Dr. Reeves emerged from the barn, where she'd been working on cataloging salvageable equipment from various abandoned facilities. "Are we talking about organized raiding now?" "Looks like it," Carmen replied. "The thing is, I can understand the logic. Resources are limited, winter's coming, and cooperation requires trust. It's probably easier to just take what you need than to negotiate and hope the other party keeps their word." Louisa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. They'd chosen their location specifically because it was defensible. A small farm surrounded by hills with clear sight lines in all directions. But defensible was relative when you had 18 people against organized raiders. "What about government?" asked Jessica, one of their newest arrivals. She'd been a county administrator before the collapse. "Are there any official authorities left?" Carmen laughed bitterly. "I've been in touch with what's left of the National Guard in 3 states. Most units dissolved within the first month. Turns out, when 80% of your personnel die overnight, maintaining military discipline becomes impossible. The remaining Guard units are basically well-armed settlement groups at this point." "The few that exist," Elena added. "I heard that Fort Campbell had a complete breakdown, fighting over supplies and leadership. The surviving Guard members scattered to different civilian settlements." Maya had been quietly tending to the vegetable plots, but now she looked up. "My cousin Maria was with a group in New Mexico that tried to maintain some kind of local government, elections, laws, the whole thing. It lasted about 2 months before people got tired of following rules when there was no way to enforce them." "What happened?" Louisa asked. "Someone decided the elected council was taking too much of the food stores for themselves. True or not, enough people believed it. They stormed the council meeting, and it turned into a free-for-all. 3 people died, including Maria." Maya's voice remained steady, but her hands shook slightly as she worked. Jessica wrapped her arms around herself. "So what are our options? Become raiders ourselves, or wait to be raided?" "There's a third option," Dr. Reeves said slowly. "The Whitmore Institute has a complete genetic preservation lab, frozen embryos, artificial gestation technology, the works." Louisa studied the photographs and diagrams that Reeves spread out on their makeshift outdoor table. The equipment looked impossibly complex: banks of monitors, refrigeration systems, delicate instruments that would require not just power but precise calibration. "How much of it could we actually use?" Elena asked, leaning over their shoulders. "That's the question," Reeves admitted. "The facility's been under emergency power for months on a small hydropower generator. Even if we could have everything running, I'd need to relearn half the procedures. And we'd need steady electricity, purified chemicals, sterile conditions, plus security, Carmen added grimly. If word gets out that we have that kind of technology, every desperate group within 100 miles will want it, either to use it or to destroy it, to prevent anyone else from using it. Maya looked up from sharpening garden tools. Shouldn't we focus on keeping ourselves alive first? The debate that followed stretched into the evening. Some argued for immediate practicality, better shelters, more reliable food production, basic medicine. Others insisted they needed to think beyond mere survival. But underlying all of it was the question that none of them wanted to voice directly. How long before the violence reached them? As if summoned by their fears, the radio crackled to life. Carmen rushed to answer it, and they could all hear the panicked voice on the other end. Anyone listening, this is Sacramento Base. We're under attack. Repeat, we are under. The transmission cut to static. Carmen tried to raise them again, but got no response. She switched to other frequencies, calling settlements they'd been in contact with. Of the 12 groups they'd been talking to regularly, only 7 answered. 2 reported recent raids. 1 was planning to relocate after receiving threats. Another had split apart after a leadership dispute turned violent. We need to make a decision, Louisa said finally, looking around at the faces lit by their campfire. Stay isolated and hope we're overlooked, or try to build something bigger: alliances, trade networks, mutual defense agreements. Carmen checked the action on her rifle. Either way, we need better security. I've been doing an inventory of weapons in the area. There's a guard armory about 30 miles north. If it hasn't been looted, we could arm everyone in the settlement. Then what? Elena asked. We become another armed camp, suspicious of everyone who approaches? Dr. Reeves stared into the fire. I keep thinking about those embryos, not just the technology, but what they represent. The possibility that this doesn't have to be the end of everything, but that only matters if we can build societies stable enough to make use of them. Louisa listened to the debate continue, watching shadows dance on the barn walls. Outside, she could hear the wind through trees that would soon need pruning, in gardens that would need expanding, around a settlement that felt as fragile as everything else they'd lost. The difference was, now they knew how fragile everything was, and how quickly it could be taken away. Chapter 4. Fragile Beginnings. 1 year later, Louisa stood on the small hill overlooking their settlement as dawn broke over their carefully tended fields. What had once been desperate scavenging had evolved into something resembling a Community 9 crude but weatherproof structures, a functioning well, vegetable plots that would actually sustain them through winter. Elena emerged from the workshop she'd built around a salvaged generator, wiping grease from her hands. They had electricity for 4 hours each day now, enough to run essential equipment and charge their few remaining electronic devices. It was a far cry from the connected world they'd once known, but it worked. The radio picked up a transmission from the Portland group, Elena reported. They've got 41 people now, and they think they've figured out how to manufacture basic medicines. Progress came in small victories. Dr. Reeves had finally managed to turn online some of the genetic preservation equipment, though she estimated they were still years away from attempting reproduction. Maya's agricultural experiments were yielding better crops. They'd even established contact with 6 other settlements, sharing knowledge through carefully scheduled radio conversations. But the victories were balanced by constant reminders of how precarious their position remained. Carmen approached from the radio shed, her expression grim. I just lost contact with the Riverside settlement. They were supposed to check in this morning. Equipment failure? Louisa asked, though she could see from Carmen's face that it wasn't. Unknown, but the Fresno group reported smoke on the horizon in their direction 2 days ago. Could be a wildfire? Could be. She didn't need to finish. The Sisters of Necessity had become a persistent threat across the region. Unlike other raider groups that struck randomly, they seemed to be following a deliberate strategy targeting settlements with useful resources or strategic locations, then moving on before any organized response could form. They'd hit 7 settlements in the past 3 months, leaving 3 completely abandoned and the others weakened. "Any word from the Northern Alliance?" Louisa asked. Carmen nodded. "They're still trying to coordinate a joint response, but it's complicated. 8 different settlements, each with their own priorities and leadership styles. Getting them to agree on anything takes weeks. The Northern Alliance was their best hope for long-term security, a loose confederation of settlements that had agreed to mutual aid and defense. But like everything in their new world, it was fragile, held together by personal relationships and handshake agreements rather than legal frameworks. "The problem is trust," Dr. Reeves observed, emerging from the barn where she'd been working on equipment maintenance. "We're asking people to risk their lives for neighbors they've known for months, not generations." Elena wiped her hands on a rag. "It's worse than that. We're asking them to risk their lives for neighbors who might not even be there next month. Half the settlements we've worked with have relocated at least once. Hard to build loyalty when everyone's a refugee." Maya called out from the garden, where she was teaching 2 of the young girls how to identify edible plants. "We're getting visitors." Louisa looked toward the access road and saw 3 women approaching on foot, carrying heavy backpacks and what looked like medical supplies. As they got closer, she recognized Dr. Amanda Foster, who had led the Riverside settlement. "Amanda!" Louisa called out, running toward them. "We've been trying to reach you for days." Amanda's face was streaked with ash and exhaustion. "Riverside's gone. The sisters hit us 4 nights ago. We barely escaped with these supplies and our lives." The 3 women were the only survivors from a settlement of 26. The sisters had surrounded their camp at night, demanded they surrender all weapons and medical supplies, then set fire to the buildings when the residents tried to negotiate. "They're not just raiding anymore," Amanda said, as Maya brought them food and water. "They're eliminating competition. One of them told me they plan to control all resources in the region within 6 months." Carmen was already at the radio, trying to contact other Alliance settlements. "If they're moving to territorial control instead of just raiding, that changes everything. We need to coordinate a response now, before they pick us off one by one." But coordination proved as difficult as ever. The Alliance settlements were spread across hundreds of miles, connected only by radio and the occasional trading expedition. Some wanted to band together for mutual defense. Others preferred to relocate farther from the sisters' territory. A few suggested trying to negotiate with the raiders. "We're dealing with a fundamental problem of scale," Elena observed during one of their evening planning sessions. "In the old world, we had police forces, militaries, intelligence networks that could respond to organized threats. Now, it takes us 3 days just to get a message to our allies and coordinate a meeting." Dr. Reeves looked up from her notes. "Maybe that's why groups like the Sisters are succeeding. They've embraced a simpler organizational model, might makes right. Follow orders or die. It's brutal, but it's efficient." "So what do we do?" Jessica asked. "Become like them?" Louisa considered the question seriously. "It would be easier, in some ways. Stop worrying about consensus and cooperation. Take what they needed, eliminate threats before they became dangerous." But that path led to a world where the strongest preyed on everyone else, where knowledge and culture meant less than weapons and ruthlessness. "No," she said finally. "But we do need to get better at organized defense. The Alliance concept is right, but our implementation is too slow and too loose." Over the following weeks, they worked to strengthen connections with surviving settlements. Carmen established regular communication schedules and emergency protocols. Maya organized seed and knowledge exchanges that created mutual dependencies. Dr. Reeves shared technical expertise that made their allies more valuable to each other than to raiders. Elena focused on practical matters, helping other settlements improve their defenses, sharing techniques for maintaining equipment, teaching basic engineering skills that might prevent communities from collapsing due to technical failures. But the threat continued to grow. The sisters absorbed smaller raider groups, swelling their numbers and expanding their territory. Reports suggested they now had over 200 fighters and were moving toward a more permanent occupation model, establishing bases and demanding tribute from settlements they allowed to survive. "We're at a tipping point," Louisa realized during an Alliance radio conference. "Either we figure out how to work together effectively, or we get picked off individually." The conference lasted 3 days and included 12 settlements. By the end, they had agreements on mutual defense, resource sharing, and coordinated response protocols. It wasn't a government, none of them had the authority to create that, but it was a framework for cooperation that might evolve into something stronger. As she walked to the edge of their property, where a simple wooden cross marked Michael's grave, Louisa reflected on how much had changed. She'd carved his name herself, along with the words he'd spoken. "Build something better." "We're trying," she whispered to the marker. Behind her, she could hear women discussing plans for expanding the solar panel array, debating seed varieties for next season, teaching the young girls essential skills by lamplight. But she could also hear Carmen cleaning weapons and Elena working on defensive barriers. Their conversations were filled with practical concerns that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago. Water filtration, wood preservation, the basics of metallurgy, but also guard schedules, ammunition counts, and escape routes. The path ahead stretched long and uncertain. Rebuilding anything resembling their former civilization would take decades, maybe generations. But as Louisa watched the sun rise over their modest fields, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope tempered by hard-won wisdom. They were no longer just surviving, and they weren't naive about the challenges ahead. They were building something new, something that acknowledged both human nature's capacity for cooperation and its tendency toward violence. It wouldn't be the world they'd lost, but it might eventually be better.